Dr. Sheri Strydhorst. She's a research scientist with Alberta Agriculture and Rural Development based in Barrhead. She joined Alberta Agriculture in January of 2013, and she's conducting agronomic research on cereal crops and plant growth regulators. Prior to that, she was the executive director of the Alberta Pulse Growers Commission. She completed her PhD in 2008 and her Master of Science in 2003. And Sheri, her husband, and her daughter have a grain farm in Nearlandia. So
I wanted to start out with the bigger picture and what is the role of crop scientists and farmers in feeding the world. Wheat, for example, provides 20% of humanity's calories. And I know we heard some different numbers this morning, but from my reference, the world population is to stabilize at about 9 billion people in 2050, and if it's more than that, then we have an even bigger problem on our hands. Given a 9 billion people population, what that's going to require is an increase in wheat demand of 1.7% per year. However, on a global scale, we're increasing our wheat productivity on 1.1% per year. So you can see we've got a problem here. By 2050, we're not going to be feeding everyone. And in Western Canada, our productivity is increasing at 1.7% or 1.4% per year, so still not even at that level where we need to be. So we need our cereal yields to increase on a global scale from 3.2 tons per hectare to 4.3 tons per hectare. In Western Canada, we're at 2.4, so we have a long ways to go. In terms of doing that, some increases in cultivated land, but I think what the big thing is going to be is a combination of breeding and agronomy. There's big yield gaps between what we're able to achieve theoretically and what we actually achieve on the field scale. So as part of my job is how do we lessen that gap and get the bigger yields on wide acreage. So just to give you an idea of how much of the yield increase is going to be coming from breeding or agronomy, it really depends what your starting point is. For example, in Asia and Latin America, where maybe the farming practices aren't as good, breeding is going to contribute a smaller amount to the yield increase. Whereas somewhere like the UK, where they're really on top of agronomy, most of the yield increases are going to come from breeding advances. And you know, I think both are very important, and they both need to move forward together. So in my research project, what we're looking at is advanced agronomic practices to increase yields and bridge that yield gap. So I'm going to go through these three main practices in just a little bit of detail so you know where I'm coming from and what the treatments are. The first one is supplemental urea ammonium nitrate, or UAN, and this is of course topping up your nitrogen level in season to maximize yield, but the timing of when you apply that nitrogen is really critical in terms of what response you get. What you need to do is have that nitrogen available when the crop has its highest nitrogen needs. In cereal crops, that's from the start of elongation or the end of tillering until heading. And you need that nitrogen there before that happens so it's available so the plant can use it during that time period. If you put your top-up nitrogen application on later in the growing season, you get a protein boost. Not a bad thing, but not what we're trying to achieve when increasing yields. And under high moisture environments, we certainly have found other published research that this works. Now, the next big thing, I think there's a lot of hype out there about plant growth regulators. And in Western Canada, Manipulator with the active ingredient chlormaclot chloride was registered this summer for wheat and will be commercially available for the upcoming growing season. And there's a second plant growth regulator in the process of registration for wheat, and ethyl is there too, but it's not being actively promoted. And the intent of these plant growth regulators is to produce shorter, thicker, stronger stems to reduce lodging in intensive management systems. They're not intended to increase yields. There are some instances of that, but they're really for a harvest management tool. Now, the other thing that I'm looking at is foliar fungicides, and these can create dramatic yield increases between 5.5% to 44% yield gains. And it really depends what your starting point is in terms of your variety. If you have a variety that has genetic resistance to the disease that is in your field, the fungicides aren't going to benefit you. And you also need to have the disease conditions hot and humid for that pathogen to propagate. And you can see just in the bottom photo here, you can see all the brown leaves versus the one that was sprayed There's the unsprayed and the sprayed, and just having that huge difference in the amount of green leaf tissue that can photosynthesize and contribute to yield makes a big difference in what you get at the end of the day. The next theory underlying a lot of my research is Liebig's law of the minimum. And what that states is that growth is controlled not by the amount of total resources, but by the scarcest resource. And you can see in this diagram that moisture is the stave on the barrel that is the shortest. And without moisture, that's the thing that's limiting our yield. If you add more nitrogen, if you add more boron, it's not going to help increase yields, because in this scenario, moisture is the thing that's limiting yields. To increase yields, you need to add more moisture. And this is kind of a context to look at some of the results in. At one location, I had 4 inches of precipitation over the growing season. You'd guess that the treatments don't do much because moisture is the limiting factor. Just in terms of some of the base agronomic practices that we did to kind of get those staves of the barrel as high as possible is we direct seeded, we treated our seed, used a high seeding rate, a pre-seed burn-off, seeding as early as possible, early in-season weed control, and high water volumes with our fungicides. Now you guys are thinking, what's so advanced about this? This isn't new. What is new about this research is using a systems approach. There's been, of course, a lot of testing to say, do fungicides work? Does top-up nitrogen work? But what I'm doing is looking at these management practices together in a systems approach. Of course, as you guys as farmers, you don't just spray a fungicide. You also have that added nitrogen, you have that added plant growth regulator. So what I'm looking at is the combined effect, and to see if there's synergies or negative interactions between these different agronomic practices. So the research project that I'm running is called Advanced Agronomic Practices in Wheat, Barley, and Pea to Maximize Yield and Harvestability. And it's a province-wide research program that's been very greatly supported by the commissions, by the provincial funding groups, and also industry. A lot of industry support behind this, which is hopefully making it very relevant to you guys, the growers. Now, there's a lot of words on this slide, and it is the objectives. And just really quickly, at a high level, what I'm doing in the first objective is to compare 48 different management practices in wheat and 64 different management practices in barley. Things that you guys can't do on a field scale, something that I can do in small plot research. And then what we're doing to make sure that the small plot research is valid at the field scale, if you've heard of the wheat 150 or barley 180 strip trials, what I'm doing is using similar treatments from those in the small plots and making sure that the rankings are coming out the same, so that what I'm doing is valid for you at the field level. One of the really cool things about the experiments is, I'm unfortunately not going to have time to talk about this today, is looking at how different wheat and barley varieties respond to these intensive agronomic practices, and getting to the idea of cultivar-specific agronomy, which early results are suggesting that is, for intensive management, where we're going to have to go. I am looking at improving field pea harvestability. I have heard in this part of the world you guys don't have the issues that we have in central Alberta with keeping peas standing through harvest, but in central Alberta it's a huge, huge problem, taking 5 days to harvest a quarter section of peas, which is no fun. And then looking at different fungicide timings and groups on barley. So the project began in 2014 and it runs for 2015 and 2016, and it's province-wide. We've got an irrigated site down at McGrath, a site at High River, a east central location at Killam. My site is at Bonnecourt, and then at Foliar. So at the end of the day, we'll have 15 site years of data, which is a fairly robust data set to make sure the trends we're seeing are seen repeatedly. Okay, in terms of precipitation, it got drier as we went from the south of province up north. McGrath, this is the combination of rainfall plus irrigation. We had 16.7 inches of precipitation, or of moisture, and then up at Foliar we had only 4 inches. So incredibly dry to incredibly wet, and that's going to really impact the results we did see. In terms of growing degree days, our warmest site was actually my Bonnecourt site by Edmonton, but for the most part all sites were normal or above normal. Now this is the experiment where we're looking at 48 different management practices. And I'm going to give you a quick plot tour of what happened. I know I'm not expecting you to read that, but you can see there's colored strips running across, and those are our different rates of UAN that we added. So the bottom strip has no extra UAN. The next one up, we added an extra 30 pounds of nitrogen just prior to stem elongation, and then an extra 60 pounds, and then an extra 30 pounds plus agrotane. And running up and down the page, what we had was nothing special. Then we added the plant growth regulator chlormaclot chloride, which is under the trade name manipulator. Then plant growth regulator plus a flagleaf fungicide. The next strip is plant growth regulator plus fungicide application 2 weeks later, and then a dual fungicide application plus the plant growth regulator. Then we had a second unnamed plant growth regulator plus all those fungicide treatments, and then the fungicide treatment early alone, late alone, and dual. And that's where we get those 48 different management practices for. Yeah, I know, it's big and complicated, isn't it? So just a little bit more detail, our nitrogen or in-crop UAN treatments were an extra 30 pounds with agrotane, or 60 pounds. And then our plant growth regulators, we used chlormaclot chloride at the recommended label rate for wheat. At the kind of ideal stage for application, growth stage 30 to 32, our second plant growth regulator, and then our first fungicide application was twin line at flagleaf. And then we came in 2 weeks later with Prosero for our second, and that was our late. And the idea being, I know that kind of is coinciding with a head timing, but what we're actually looking at in this study, because not all areas have as big of a fusarium problem as we go north, is actually looking at 28 days of leaf protection with the dual fungicide application. So I always get the question, how much nitrogen do you put down at seeding? I'm just going to focus kind of on the McGrath and High River sites for you guys because they're probably most relevant geographically. So at our irrigated site, there was 120 pounds of nitrogen put down at seeding, or there was some of that was fall applied. And then at High River, there were 85 pounds of nitrogen applied. In terms of the yield goal that we are setting, this comparing the 48 different management practices was done with CPS wheat. And what we did was we took the cooperator's long-term AFSC yield average from the past 10 years, and under irrigation we were targeting for our base 100 bushels per acre, at High River 55, just based on what is the different growing potential in the different areas across the province. Now, this is stats, not fun, but I guess I'm glad I'm showing it to show that there is a little bit of science behind here. And the only thing I want you to look at is the red numbers. Where there's a red number, that means there was a statistically significant response. And you'll see that there was a UAN response at 3 locations, and a treatment, which is a combination of those plant growth regulator and fungicide treatments at all locations. And we're going to start looking at a little bit of data. So what was the yield response to UAN? So we had a positive yield response at Lethbridge and High River, our irrigated site in High River, and a negative yield response at Foliar, where it was super dry. So at High River, you can see with no UAN, the yield was 76 bushels per acre. The next bar over is 78 bushels when we added an extra 30 pounds, 83 when we added 30 pounds plus agrotane, or 84 bushels when we added the extra 60 pounds of nitrogen. So an 11 to 9% yield increase with the 30 pounds plus agrotane, or the extra 60 pounds. And then at Foliar, where it was incredibly dry, adding extra 60 pounds of nitrogen was a bad idea. You wouldn't do this, but because of research, we do include these treatments, and we kind of burnt things and didn't do good things, but no one in their right mind would do that anyways, other than crazy researchers. The next thing is the yield response to plant growth regulators. And remember, I said the intent of plant growth regulators is as a harvest management aid. They're not to increase yields. Well, guess what? We saw a yield response, and I don't think anyone's going to complain with that. Now, these are at our high to adequate moisture environments, so Lethbridge, High River, and Killam. And you can see that the control and the chlormaclot chloride had identical yields, no statistical difference there. But plant growth regulator B, that unnamed one, we are actually getting a yield boost at all these locations. So because this is kind of early testing with this plant growth regulator in Western Canada, an exciting trend, but we do need to have 10 more site years of data to see if we continue to see this trend. But certainly positive, and you know, with the chlormaclot chloride, it is doing what it's supposed to in these cases. Now in our dry environments at my site at Bonnecourt and up in the piece at Foliar, we unfortunately did see a yield decrease with the chlormaclot chloride. And in talking to Engage Agro, they do have a booth here. On CPS, they don't generally see a yield boost, and right on the label it does say do not use this product under drought stress, heat stress, on and on. And what we can do as researchers is try and quantify how much was too dry, so we have some soil moisture data to see how much too dry possibly it was, and then look at not using it when we have that kind of dryness to make sure you guys don't see these type of yield decreases. Now the fungicide, this is where the big yield response is. We had a positive yield response at 4 of 5 sites, not at Foliar because of course it was dry, but nonetheless, let's take a look at this. And there was an interaction with the plant growth regulator. So what I'm going to show you is, I know there's a lot of data, but let's just look at the blue bars. And this is at High River, where we start out with the control. And that was just those plots, nothing special, just business as usual, yielded 60 bushels per acre. And in the absence of a plant growth regulator, with the flag fungicide application, we increased yields by 33 to 37%, boosting them up to 80 bushels per acre, 82 bushels with the sole late fungicide application. And the dual fungicide application gave us an extra 89 bushel, or an extra 29 bushels to get us to 89 bushels per acre. So a 48% yield increase. And in your abstract, little error on my part, it says 45. You can scratch that out and change it to 48. Now at Killam, our drier environment, want to show you this for the contrast, where we don't quite have the ideal conditions for disease development. The yield increases were smaller. We started out with a control yield of 109 bushels per acre and a 6% yield increase with the flag fungicide application, and then a 13 to 15% yield increase with that late or the dual fungicide application. So here, obviously, the sole late application of fungicide would have been the best bet. And a little bit of economics, just comparing economics on the plant growth regulator and the fungicide treatments. And what these are, first on this slide, is just a compilation of the control yield, the plant growth regulator yield, and the yield with the early fungicide, late fungicide, and the dual fungicide. And you will see here on the next slide the net economic benefit. So what this is let's say we had the extra 29 bushels of yield at High River with the dual fungicide application. Maybe I'll just orient you as to where that is. That's where this 92 is, and right there. So those extra 29 bushels of yield, assuming a wheat price of $4.68 for CPS, and a cost of applying that fungicide of $7 for a custom app and the product itself, your net return was $92 per acre. So you can see at McGrath, High River, and Killam, the fungicides all paid, with generally that late fungicide application, at least at McGrath and Killam, making you the highest returns. All the bars below, that blue one is the plant growth regulator. We remember that the chlormaclot chloride plant growth regulator actually didn't cause a yield benefit. It was the same as the control, so it cost us money, but if it's going to allow you to straight cut that crop instead of having to go in or fight with a laying down crop, that's kind of the management advantage there. Just to summarize the trends that we saw with wheat, with UAN, we saw a 4 to 11% yield increase with the 60 pounds of nitrogen at McGrath and Foliar, or at McGrath and High River, but at our dry site we saw a yield decrease, and of course that kind of makes sense. With the plant growth regulator in high moisture environments, that plant growth regulator B actually showed a yield increase of 4 to 8%, and in dry environments the chlormaclot chloride showed a yield decrease. In terms of the fungicide in those moist environments, particularly our irrigated site and at High River, the single fungicide application increased yields between 28 and 37%, and the dual fungicide application between 33 and 48%. And we saw slightly smaller yield increases at Killam, but they still were profitable. Now, next we're going to move on to talk about barley, and this is feed barley, and looking actually at 64 different management practices. So I'm not going to walk you through all these details. The difference between the wheat and the barley is that in the barley I have only the one plant growth regulator, chlormaclot chloride, and I have two seeding rates, the recommended and a higher seeding rate. And with the higher seeding rate, what we're trying to do is get more plant stand uniformity to possibly respond to the plant growth regulator better. In terms of the fertilizer that we put down at seeding for feed barley, we put down 110 pounds of nitrogen per acre and 85 pounds at High River. Here we saw actually a fairly big response to UAN at all locations and somewhat of a treatment effect. So let's go through these in detail. The yield response to UAN on the feed barley, I should just mention that this is a variety Amos, which is actually a new variety bred out of the Field Crop Development Center at Lacombe, and saw a yield response at 4 of 5 sites. And at McGrath, our irrigated site, we saw between a 4 to 7% yield increase with adding this top of nitrogen. Is that going to make sense economically? We do have to run the numbers on that. And if anyone can get me some good prices on UAN, please come talk to me later, because that's one of the struggles we're having with this project right now. And then at High River, we saw also the same type of yield increases, ranging from 8 to 12% yield increase by adding those extra 30 to 60 pounds of nitrogen. In terms of the yield response to our plant growth regulator, we actually saw a fairly different trend than what we saw in the wheat. We saw a yield response at all 5 locations. Only 4 of the yield responses were significant. Where we saw, with the application of the chlormaclot chloride or the manipulator, we saw a yield increase between 1.4% or 6%. This is not something that we expected to see, nor has the company seen, so we need to test to see if this is related to the cultivar and oddity, but we still do have 10 more site years to see if this is a trend, because that certainly wouldn't be a bad side effect from this plant growth regulator on barley. And then the yield response to fungicide, we did see slightly different trends with the 22 plant seeding rate, or the recommended, versus the 33 plants. And we got, under irrigation, a 5 to 8% yield increase. So we saw a much smaller yield increase with the fungicide on our barley than we did with our wheat. And this kind of was a trend throughout all locations. And I think that might speak to the fact that maybe the variety actually has some better genetic resistance to the pathogens that were there in the environment. So to summarize, for barley, we saw a 4 to 7% yield increase with 30 pounds of nitrogen at 3 sites, and a 7 to 12% yield increase with 60 pounds of nitrogen at 2 sites. The plant growth regulator, we saw that small yield increase between 4 and 6%. It might be cultivar specific. We do need to look at this further, but generally good news there. I should say that we haven't had a chance to go through all the lodging data and so forth, but you can see I guess from visually looking at it, we still had standability issues with the barley, unfortunately, so I'm not sure we're solving all of those issues on barley there. For fungicide, we saw a smaller response on barley than what we did see on wheat, a significant response only at 2 of 5 sites, unlike the wheat that we saw at 4 sites, and the single fungicide application increased yields between 5 and 10%. And you know, this might have something to do again with the cultivar. Now this, how much time do I have left? 3 minutes? Okay, I'm going to skip this experiment because unfortunately we probably don't have time to talk about it. Really quick, it looked like when comparing Carumba, Headline, and Twinline, Headline and Twinline seem to perform a little bit better than Carumba, and I think that's partially due to what stage the pathogen was at when we were spraying it. But if you want to learn more about that, you can certainly come talk to me about that later. And we've got lots and lots and tons of data. It's kind of overwhelming. So I've got biomass data, lodging data, disease, NDVI, which is a measure of greenness, heights, maturity to finish the economic analysis. We're getting everything graded according to CGC grades, 1,000 kernel weight, NIR protein. And then in another experiment with the different varieties, we're looking at baking quality on our hard reds and how they respond to these different management practices. And then we're going to do it all again. And I've gone through the trends, I think, probably enough times. But I really would like to thank the technical support who came out to make this possible. Doom Poly's crew was responsible for the Lethbridge irrigated site and High River. Robin Bonus out of Lacombe was responsible for the Killam site. My crew out of CDC North and Barhead, and then Sarda was responsible for the site up in Foliar, and really couldn't have done it without them. And if we have a quick minute, I'll take a question, or you guys can certainly talk to me over the next couple days. I overwhelmed you, or I put you to sleep? Thanks very much.